Welcome back, Focus Learners, to another explainer. I am just so thrilled you're joining us today because we are unpacking something absolutely fascinating. And honestly, it's vital. We're going to deconstruct the psychological architecture of manipulation based entirely on our source material. We're going to see exactly how control operates, not through physical force, no, but through structure. We're going to look at how these systems are built, literally brick by psychological brick, so you can see them coming from a mile away. Nobody who has ever been in a cult thought they were joining one. Every single person who has ever been controlled by one of these organizations was at some point a completely normal, intelligent, and mentally healthy individual who simply encountered the right techniques at the right moment of vulnerability. And here is what should disturb you even more. Those exact same techniques are being used right now, outside of cults, in relationships, in workplaces, by individuals. And by the end of this video, you will be able to recognize every single one of them the moment they appear. Okay, let's dive into this. To really understand how these techniques work, we've got to follow the chronological breakdown of how a mind is systematically hijacked. The absolute most dangerous myth we tell ourselves is that we're somehow immune, right? That only certain types of weak people fall for manipulation. But as we'll see as we move forward, these systems aren't targeting your intellect at all. They are targeting your fundamental human biology and psychology. Let's look at the very first step. Phase 1, love bombing and isolation. The absolutely crucial thing to understand here is that control never actually looks like control at the beginning. I mean, if it did, we'd all just run the other way. Instead, it looks like the answer to your deepest desires. So let's define exactly what we mean. Love bombing is this extraordinary, overwhelming, unconditional warmth. It's highly concentrated positive reinforcement directed right at a new recruit. It's basically like getting a whole year's worth of emotional birthday presents in a single afternoon. Why does this work so well? Because it targets universal human needs. Imagine a person who's grieving, maybe a bit lonely, or going through a massive life transition. This intense warmth isn't just pleasant, it's completely intoxicating. It builds this immediate, incredibly powerful emotional bond that entirely disarms your natural skepticism. Now, what's really interesting here is the massive contrast between internal perception and external reality. On the inside, it feels like you finally found the home you never knew you were missing. But the reality, it's a gradual, almost completely unnoticeable separation from your outside relationships. The exit door is closing, but it closes so slowly and through social comparison rather than sheer force that the target just never even notices. Outside friends just start to seem, a little less supportive or less aligned compared to this amazing new group. To ground this in documented reality, we can look at the recruitment pattern of the organization NXVM. Documented accounts show that new members frequently described feeling more seen and understood in their very first week than they had felt in their entire lives before the gradual isolation began. That is the sheer power of the love bomb. It sets up a baseline of profound trust, which is then used as the foundation before the gradual separation from family and friends even starts to happen. Phase 2, information control. Once that really deep trust is established, the organization has to seal the target's environment to keep it unchallenged. Information control is exactly what it sounds like, but its execution is incredibly subtle. It's all about creating a closed loop where the only trusted sources of knowledge are internal ones. Because think about it, if you control a person's information environment, you fundamentally control the reality they live in. Our reality is entirely constructed from the information we process, right? And cutting off outside sources is almost never framed as censorship. No one's walking up and saying, hey, don't read that because it exposes our lies. No way. Instead, it's framed as protection. It's framed as spiritual discernment or protecting your mind from toxic or negative influences. So the target actively participates in their own censorship, truly believing they're making a healthy, protective choice. A practical, documented example of this can be seen in the practices of Jehovah's Witnesses. The organization formally discourages its members from reading outside religious material. And crucially, this isn't presented as a restriction of freedom at all. It is framed directly as protection from spiritually dangerous or corrupting content. Outside information is actively labeled as a literal threat to the members' well-being. Phase 3, thought stopping. But you might be wondering, what happens when contradictory information does manage to slip through? Or when a person just naturally has a moment of logical doubt? Well, that is exactly when the organization relies on thought stopping. They have to ensure that internal doubts are neutralized immediately. This is a taught reflexive mental response. It could be a prayer, a specific chant, or just a repeated phrase. The member is trained to deploy this response the literal second an uncomfortable thought enters their mind. It actively kills a doubt before it ever has the chance to develop into a fully formed question. It's basically like a mental pop-up blocker, but specifically for your own analytical thoughts. And this brilliantly illustrates the tragic irony of the tactic. To the member, suppressing their own questions feels like spiritual discipline. It feels like mental hygiene, like, choosing faith over fear. But the reality is the systematic elimination of critical thinking. A person's own analytical mind becomes completely inaccessible to them at the exact moment they need it most to protect themselves. We can actually see this operationalized formally in organizations like Scientology. There is documented practice within Scientology of using specific mental drills and techniques that are explicitly designed to actively interrupt doubt before it develops into a question. It's a formalized system of mental redirection to ensure the individual doesn't follow a critical thought to its logical conclusion. Phase 4. Us versus them. Okay, so now the member is isolated, their information is controlled, and their internal doubts are totally suppressed. The organization now moves to escalate things, artificially raising the stakes of leaving to catastrophic levels. Let's walk through exactly how this happens step by step. Step 1, the outside world is thoroughly painted as the enemy, as dark, lost, or dangerous. Step 2, total dependence on the group is forged, emotionally, socially, and often financially. And Step 3, the cost of leaving is made seemingly unsurvivable. You have to realize that at this point, leaving doesn't just mean changing your mind anymore. It suddenly means losing your community, your identity, and sometimes your actual home, all in one single devastating moment. A chilling example of this is found in the documented accounts of former Heaven's Gate members. They describe the outside world as being painted as so spiritually contaminated that the mere thought of returning to it felt genuinely impossible. At this stage, a member stays not necessarily because they still truly believe the doctrine, but because the alternative to staying is perceived as entirely unsurvivable. Phase 5, confession as leverage. Finally, we reach the lock on the psychological cage. This is the ultimate mechanism to ensure compliance, even if all those other phases begin to fail. Strategic confession is the formal, or sometimes informal, requirement for members to share their deepest fears, secrets, and worst past mistakes with the group or its leadership. Because the members know this highly sensitive information is being stored, it creates a deeply powerful unconscious incentive to never step out of line or question authority. So, the crucial point is how this vulnerability is disguised. Members perceive this act as radical honesty, right? As a beautiful path to communal healing and freedom. The grim reality, however, is that they are handing over a comprehensive file of their own vulnerabilities. Their trust is literally being weaponized into leverage, held in reserve to ensure they never, ever walk away. And listen, this isn't just some fringe group tactic. We see this in professional and corporate spaces today. There are documented practices within certain intense leadership organizations that required written confessions of past behavior from participants, confessions that were explicitly held on file. It proves that this architecture of manipulation is highly adaptable and absolutely present in our everyday societal structures. As we bring this explainer to a close, I want you to consider these core concepts: belonging, meaning, community, certainty. This is what you must take away from our time today. Control tactics do not attack a person's intelligence. They work because they brilliantly, flawlessly fulfill these universal human needs. They give you exactly what you're starving for, just long enough to spring the trap. The techniques that build cults do not require a cult to work. They only require a person with a need and someone who knows exactly how to meet it just long enough to take everything else away. Knowing this does not make you paranoid. It makes you the one person in the room who sees the door before it closes.